Genesis chapter 10 tonight. Some years back, I don't remember how many, it wasn't too far back actually, Neil and I and another fella went clear down to, and I believe it was Athens, Ohio. It was down in the southern part of Ohio, to the ordination of a young man that had served with me at Eastside for a year after he graduated from Bible college. And being down there, I found it interesting. The pastor in the church that was doing the ordaining had actually a large Chinese ministry. I don't remember now, but I was somewhat amazed at the number of Chinese students they had that had come from China, were there because there was a university there. And it was interesting, but he mentioned a book that someone had published some time ago concerning the fact that there are things in the Chinese language that actually take you back to Genesis. At the time, I remember him talking about that and then just dismissed it from my mind after that because I had no reason probably to retain it. Probably a month and a half ago, Neil said that he had a copy of the book and he brought it and loaned it to me. It's called The Discovery of Genesis by C.H. King and Ethel Nelson. I read the thing go through and quite fascinated by it and thought in the back of my mind, you know, there maybe is a message there. And so I kind of put it in the back of my mind. And one day when I had time, I started working on it, and I thought, no, that maybe is a little bit bizarre, and so I laid it aside. I didn't throw it away. And then a couple weeks ago, I thought, I'm going to go back and work on that a little more. So I went back and went through some things, and that's where this message came from. And some of the things I say, I'll have to be very honest with you, I don't know beans about them. I got them from this book. And so I hope that'll make a little bit of understanding eventually when I get into what I want to do in particular. I've entitled the message this evening, When a Nation Turns from God. My purpose basically is this: to study how when a nation turns from God, God gives them up. And my question is, what can we do for the United States of America? I'm afraid sometimes we're on the brink of God giving us up. And when I get to the end of the message, very briefly we'll talk about the fact of what can we do about it. After the flood, Noah and his 3 sons populated the earth. Genesis 10 actually gives you those first generations that came about after they came out of the ark. The only one that continues in the Bible, of course, is Shem's line. You have Shem, Ham, and Japheth, but Shem is the only one that actually continues the line in the genealogy on through the Scriptures, and of course that's because it is the history of Abram and the Jewish people, and that's why it continues to trace that through, where the others basically, you have that first generations and then it's not given any further. Then in chapter 11, it actually tells us how the people were scattered throughout the face of the earth as we have them today, as a result, basically, of the Tower of Babel. I believe that actually chapter 11 is an explanation of chapter 10. Probably we have a tendency to divide chapter 10 from chapter 11 and don't associate the two, but I think they belong together. You have the details of chapter 10, but chapter 11 actually tells you how it happened, what he describes happened in chapter 10. Notice in chapter 10 of Genesis, the very last verse, these are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations in their nations. And by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. That last statement of that verse actually is an explanation that explains to you how you have all of the people scattered all over the earth, why they have all of these different languages and these different cultures. Ultimately, in the end, this is what happened. They were divided by their various nations after the time of the flood in particular. In chapter 11, then, it tells exactly how those families of Noah then were divided and how that came about, which we'll get back to here in a moment. First, I want to again back up to chapter 10, and chapter 10 starts in chapter 10 and verse 2 with this statement, the sons of Japheth, and it names them Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tyrus. And then it goes on and names the various generations of people that were there. So that starts the genealogy of Japheth and his family in particular, one of the sons of Noah. But if you drop down to verse 5, that is the end of the discussion of Japheth's families, and probably most of us here actually are descendants of Japheth. But these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their family, and in their nations. So we learn from that the families of Japheth eventually divided and separated from the other families because of the tongue. Language was changed. And of course, again, chapter 11 tells you how and why those languages actually developed and they went in their various directions, and explains how that happened. And of course, again, understand that when they came out of the ark, they all spoke the same language. There was only one language, one tongue. But now when they were divided after the Tower of Babel, they eventually went their own direction because God gave them their own language. This means, of course, that Japheth's descendants had their own language and they went off in their own direction. And of course, this had to have been after the Tower of Babel in chapter 11. That's why I say chapter 11 explains how chapter 10 came about. Then if you notice in verse 6 of chapter 10, and the sons of Ham were Cush and Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan. There you have again Noah's other son, Ham, and it names the generations in particular that came from him. Again, if you drop down to verse 20, it ends with his genealogies. These are the sons of Ham, after their families, after the tongues, in their countries, and in their nations. So again, of Ham's families, it says they finally were divided, and again, according to their tongues, developing their own countries, their own nations, as God intended, which again is the result of what transpired in chapter 11. Then if you go to verse 21, it picks up with the genealogies of Shem. Unto Shem also, the father of the children of Eber, which is believed that that was the beginning of the word Hebrew, the Hebrew or Jewish people, the brother of Japheth, the elder, even to his were children born. To him were children born. So it gives the genealogies of Shem, and then you drop down to verse 20, 10 through 20, verse 20 on further down to verse 31. And these are the sons of Shem, after their families, after their tongues, in their lands, after their nations. So again, we have the same basic development. Concludes that Shem's family went off in their own direction. Again, they had their own tongue. They formed their own nations, and again were divided, which again, chapter 11 is actually what describes for us how that happened and why it came to pass. So in Genesis 11, 10 through 26, it traces then the genealogies of Shem through Abraham, which we're not going to get into, but if you take a note and look over there in particular, that genealogy is traced through, of course, because of the significance of Abraham in particular. I want to take you back now to Ham's people in particular, again, still back in chapter 10, and this time verse 6. It says, and the sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan. So Ham had 4 sons, and it names them Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan. This, of course, is where the Canaanites in particular came from. When Joshua took the people into the land to conquer it, it was the Canaanites they conquered it, and they came from Ham's people in particular, as it names them and those generations as they came. Cush also had a son that is named here Nimrod, which again was part of the descendants of Ham, in verse 8. And Cush begat Nimrod, and he began to be a mighty one in the earth. Nimrod is an interesting character, and I think there is a description given about him because, again, it leads to the problems that actually came about in chapter 11. It says, first of all, that Nimrod was a mighty one in the earth. Evidently, he was one of those kind of people that was just a natural leader. People followed him. Whatever he did, he drew a crowd. He also speaks of the fact, I think, that he was a mighty warrior. In verse 9 it says, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. I believe when it talks about the fact that he was a mighty hunter, it's referring to the fact that he was a mighty warrior. I don't think it would be significant to the text in particular if it just simply meant that he liked to eat venison, he liked to hunt elk, and he liked to do those kind of things. I don't think that is the intent of the passage. There's nothing in Hebrew, as far as I know, that actually gives you any clue as to what it means when he was a great hunter, but I think it's referring to the fact that he actually was a great, mighty warrior. And my conclusion comes because of the results of the things of which he did. He built, actually, a great kingdom. He was a leader. People followed him. Notice in verse 10, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. So his kingdom that he developed was called Babel. And of course, eventually, I think that's where you get the term Babylon, where the city Babylon was named after that, the Empire of Babylon, which also I think even is involved in Revelation when you have the rebuilding of the old Babylonian Empire. But Nimrod is the one that actually developed this culture. And it was really an anti-God culture, something that he built totally on his own and in his own glory. But it was built in the land of Shinar, which of course we understand to be where Babylon was located, and we understand in the modern day of Iraq. And there doesn't seem to be any debate about that. That is a matter of fact that that's where the kingdom of Babel was built. Everyone spoke the same language, and we're moving now to chapter 11 and verse 1, where it explains about this kingdom that Nimrod had built. In verse 1 it says, and the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. That, of course, we would understand as they came out of the ark with the various individuals. They had their own language, they had their own speech, their own tongue. They were all one, very much unified. Now again, when you go back to chapter 10, I pointed out the verses that explained they didn't have their own tongue. So chapter 11 is explaining how that actually came to pass that eventually they were divided. In verse 2 then, where he built this kingdom of Shinar, it says, it came to pass as they journeyed from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and there they dwelt there, which is indicating this is what transpired in the fact when Nimrod began to build this great kingdom, the kingdom of Babel. Because it was near the Tigris and Euphrates River, what it was very fertile, and there along, of course, the Gulf of Aqaba, it was a logical place actually to build a kingdom. Where they could do shipping, they could do trading, they could have farmland, and they had the rivers to feed them, and so they had really a great place to build a kingdom, and that's his choice to do that. And so he was building this great kingdom of Babel, where everyone spoke the same language, everyone was unified together. Under Nimrod's leadership, they began to build a tower unto the heavens. It was an idol center of worship. It was not a tower trying to reach into heaven. When I was a little kid and heard those stories, I somehow visioned in my mind that what they were trying to do was to build a ladder and a tower, and they get it high enough they could step into heaven. That actually is not true. That's not what they were trying to do. They weren't trying to get into heaven. They simply were building an idol center of worship. And there are ziggurats that have been found they have uncovered in Iraq. And basically, when you get to the top, they were flat. And that's where they would do sacrifices, and sometimes even human sacrifices, and that's what they were doing, was actually building an idol center of worship. In verse 3 and 4, and they said one to another, go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly, that they have brick for stone, and slime they have for mortar. And they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach into heaven. Let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of all of the earth. And this seems to be the intent. They were going to have one language, one religion, a false religion, a religion without God, and one economy. I suppose you could have called it the first United Nations. When Noah came out of the ark, God had told them in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 1 that they were to populate and replenish the earth. If you drop back there in particular and read that in Genesis 9:1, God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth. That was their responsibility. They were told actually to multiply and populate and replenish the earth. Nimrod actually in his kingdom basically was saying, we're not going to do that. In other words, when God told Noah they were to take their families, they were to go different directions, they were to populate, replenish the earth, repopulate the earth. But Nimrod said, no, we aren't going to do that. He was defying God. I don't want to do that. So he got all the people together. He said, no, we're going to stay together. We're all going to be one. We're all going to be unified. We're going to have our own little group here. We're going to have our own kingdom, and that's what we're going to do. And technically, again, it really was the first United Nations. God observed Nimrod's kingdom, and he was not pleased, if you notice in verse 7. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they might understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all of the earth, and they left off to build a city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all of the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all of the earth. We notice here that the various people groups of the earth basically were placed there where they were placed by God, because God confounded their languages and scattered them. And again, as I noted, you take Japheth. At the end of the genealogy of Japheth, it says then they each had their own language, their own nation. So chapter 11 tells you now how that happened. They were scattered. They went their direction. And then it talks about Ham, the same thing. It gives their generations. And then it talks about the end of Ham's genealogies, that they each had their nation, they each had their tongue. Chapter 11 tells us now how that happened. The same thing with Shem's family. When you get down to verse 31, the same thing. They then had their own tongue, their own language, their own nation, and they went their direction in particular. And that's how the earth has gotten populated it is. That's how actually the nations have developed, because it came from chapter 11 in that passage, the discussion of the Tower of Babel. This, of course, led to the migration over all of the earth, and probably not even at one time. It probably was years where people would migrate and move and migrate and move, and as a result of that, the various languages then would be broken down, and they would change, and when one territory to another, where once they spoke the same language, it probably would begin to vary. And of course, that's true even in our own country. You go in one part of the country, and they have words and things they use that are typical of them, and you go in another part of our country, and they have words and things they use, and maybe you make fun of them, which is not right, but nevertheless, that's their culture. And so things happen like that in particular. I remember years ago, one of the charter members at Eastside Baptist was a family by the name of Schulz. They were Latvians, had come to this country as DPs after World War II. And they, once a month, actually had a Latvian service where there was a Chicago pastor who could speak the Latin, would come up and conduct a service in Latvian with a number of other people. But I remember having a discussion with her one time, and she said to me, she said that their language, the Latvian language, because I thought maybe it was like German and Russian and the countries that they bordered. And she said, no, she said it's not even related. But she said they have done some research, and she said their language actually is very common with a language in northern India. Wow, that's interesting. Which basically tells us the fact that a lot of these languages developed as people migrated to different places and carried their languages, and over time, of course, in hundreds of years, they would change. This leads me to the subject that I started out with eventually and indicated in talking about this book. It leads me to the ancient Chinese civilization as an example. The Harvard's Chinese-Japanese Yinxing Library dates the writing or the written Chinese language to approximately 2500 BC. That actually coincides with the great dispersion of the races at the Tower of Babel, which generally is dated somewhere around 2218 BC. The original religion of the ancient Chinese at the time when the written language was being formulated actually was monotheistic. And basically, one God, not idolatrous, as one might think, but monotheistic in nature. They had no idols, they had no mythology, but worshiped a single supreme ruler of heaven. The polytheist cult of Taoism and Buddhism actually came about 2,000 years later. Some of the old cultures, and I'm not talking about China here, but many old cultures have stories about how man was created and where he came from. Many of them also carry stories of Noah's flood and things of that nature, but none of them ever give the whole picture. It's just bits and pieces that you realize, and yeah, it's similar to the Bible, so obviously it tells you there is this history in particular, but China has that. China claims some 4,500 years of unbroken civilization, of which they actually have records. I'll admit I was ignorant of that before I read this book. I knew they had long history that went back, but I did not know that they actually had documented history of kings and emperors way back to that time. But who would consider China, with its religious mixture of ancestral worship, the Taoism and its myths and magic, Buddhism and its superstitions and divinations, Confucianism and its scholarly teaching, as the depository of anything that might be related to Judeo-Christianity? Generally, I would not have dreamed of that. Let's back up a little bit. Let's say in the 1st century BC, that's when Buddhism came into existence. Back up to the 5th century, further yet, BC, Taoism, Confucianism began to blossom. Now back up a bit further to 1,500 to 2,000 years more. We have a different, totally different religious atmosphere. There is evidence that the ancient Chinese originally served only one God and had no myths or idols and kept a very strict moral code. They called their God, and I am not pronouncing it right, it's spelled S-H-A-N-G space T-I, and it is pronounced something like Shaddai. Now you'll have to ask Li Juwen to pronounce it for you, and she will pronounce it correctly. But it's interesting, and I'll be mentioning that a little bit later, that it would be pronounced very similar to the Hebrew word Shaddai. They called their God that particular name, meaning the heavenly emperor. Now I want to take you to the overhead for just a moment, and bear with me because I am going to stumble through this. If you were reading the Chinese, and I don't read Chinese, and I'm not even pretending to, but this is the character that you would see that's referring to this God, Shaddai. It's made up actually of these two characters. You have the character up here that refers to an emperor, a ruler. Down here at the bottom, and you may not be able to see that, but that's the figure you have off to the left here. It talks about above heaven. That's an expression, a picture that illustrates heavenly. And so basically it comes down to this in particular. They are talking about a heavenly emperor, which is actually kind of an interesting concept of the God we serve, the heavenly emperor. And that historically is the meaning of that particular word for God. It is supposed that the Chinese originally migrated from a site in Mesopotamia, which would be the Tower of Babel, for they actually show evidence of similarity to the latter Babylonian Assyrian culture in arts, in sciences, and in government, which again, that wouldn't be surprising. They took their culture from the Tower of Babel. The approximate date of the Chinese origin is about 2500 BC, which again places us back to the Tower of Babel. It is only logical that they carried with them, when they migrated as God scattered them, that they would carry with them an accurate knowledge of biblical events from the beginning of time. That's only logical that they might do that, of which I believe they actually did. Because of the geographical isolation of China by mountain ranges, deserts, oceans, that the race of people was somewhat sealed off to itself actually for a long period of time and literally spent about 2,000 years undisturbed. Coming from the Tower of Babel, they had a spoken language as God confounded their languages, but when they came from the Tower of Babel, they obviously did not have a written language. Eventually, they invented a written language just like all other people did, but it was a system of word pictures. It was, of course, of calligraphy and pictographs. Consequently, the Chinese language is composed of characters uniquely adapted to the possibility of containing the stories of Genesis. That's where I'm going. The word for tempter is an interesting one. And again, give me just a moment to get this up here. And I don't know how well you can see it. If you want to move up closer, feel free to do so. That, of course, is the character at the top here, the character for tempter. And it's made up, of course, of a series of drawings that, again, illustrate particular things. It starts over here. You have actually this figure here. It refers to something that is secret or clandestine, that is trickery, deception. You add to it this figure that is referring to man. You have it right here. You add to it the figure that is used for garden, right here. And then it talks about alive. It uses the figure right here. That equals then this figure down here, which is not all of that, but it's only part of it. It is a figure for the devil. Then you add to that, up at the top here, you add to it the trees. How many trees? 2 trees. How many trees in the garden? The tree of life, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Interesting. You might think so. I do. You have the trees, and then over here you have the expression, and that's where it comes, I believe, here is where that fits together, but it means to cover. Ultimately, then, the word is tempter. So out of that, it seems obvious that they had a knowledge of what went on in the Garden of Eden. And it's developed in the character of their language in particular. These characters actually make that up, as we've noted. There's a reason to believe that the Chinese written language bears a testimony to prehistory, with emerging details closely resembling the Hebrew portrayal or what we find actually in the Bible. Most remarkable of all is that the Chinese characters have survived intact through the intervening thousands of years with very little modification in the meaning of their constituent parts, although the actual written forms have undergone some stylistic changes. The ancient Chinese were quite familiar with the same record which the Hebrew Moses is credited for writing some 700 to 1,000 years actually later. We're not saying that in any way that what they give is a biblical account. We're simply saying that their language portrays the very things that through inspiration God gave to Moses that we have in the book of Genesis. And it simply confirms that the book of Genesis is an accurate account. There is a tradition that the first efforts at devising a pictograph and ideographic system has been assigned to about 2500 BC. In other words, those that have studied it trace it back that far when they actually began their languages with these characters. The keeping of accurate annals naturally followed in the wake of being able to chronicle events in writing. An unfailing record of successive reigning emperors has been accurately kept from the beginning, and I'm not pronouncing this right, I'm sure, the Hesia dynasty in 2205 BC. For more than 2,000 years, China has nurtured 3 religions, of which you're more familiar with: Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. I understand that to some degree they've somewhat merged together, as you can go into a temple sometimes and they'll have both or maybe even all 3 there. Confucius was born in 551 BC, was a contemporary of both Lao Tzu and Gautama, the later bringing the founder of Buddhism from far-off India where it came from, but it was adapted then in China. Confucius sifted through the records of remote antiquity, and he drew out those principles which he felt were worth promoting. And that's why people will say, oh, Confucius say, and so on, as somewhat maybe a joke. But the truth of it is, the man sought to pull out things from history that were of moral value, and he come up with a moral code of ethics from that. And I don't know a whole lot about it, but that's basically where his teachings came from. There's a system of myths and magic and superstitions that go with all of them. But what were the religious beliefs in ancient China before 500 BC, when Confucius and well as these others developed their religions? It was during this period that the beautiful and unique calligraphy developed. A noted court historian kept careful records, preserving from one dynasty to the next. During the first 3 dynasties, the Hesia and Shang and Choi, and again, I'm probably embarrassing Li Zhuan over that, because I'm sure that's not pronounced right. From 2205 to 255 BC, they believed in a supreme heavenly ruler. As we just mentioned, and I showed you that first symbol up here of Shaddai. The ancient Chinese were monotheistic, believe in only one God. Now, I'm not trying to say in any way that all of those people were saved. I have no idea. I'm not making a judgment. I'm just saying that back in those days, they believed in only one God. It is also known that there is another word that is used. It's spelled T with a hyphen and then, or with an apostrophe and then I-E-N, meaning heaven, and also as S-H-E-N, meaning God or Spirit. And if you want to know how it's pronounced, ask Lee Wynn after the service. It's possible that all of those words, be it shung or shang or shin, may have originally been identical in pronunciation to the word we know of as Shaddai, the Hebrew word for Almighty God. It is recorded in the records of Emperor Shun in 2230 BC that they sacrificed to this god that was named Shaddai. Over 100 years ago, Protestant missionaries were translating the Bible and pondering how to translate the term for God. One of the researchers said this, and I am reading a quote that he said, "Have ever the Chinese, during the 4,000 years over which their history extends, fashioned an image of this Shaddai? They have not." In other words, they never, ever made it into an idol. They have not. Shaddai is self-existent. He existed before the heaven and the earth and the sun. He created them. He rules them. His years have no end. Now, that's not a bad theological description for God. But that comes from their ancient history and the meaning of that word that is used for God. And that's why the translators then use that some of the time in their translation into the Chinese language. The conclusion is that the written language of China was conceived during the primeval monotheistic period when the religious concepts were still pristine and the history of earlier ages unmuddled by later innovations, which would come with the Buddhism, the Taoism, the Confucianism. The records contained by many specific characters carry such a close similarity to the Hebrew Genesis that it would seem only logical to believe that they had both civilizations most of access to the same common historical knowledge, as we find, obviously, in the Scriptures. Now, I want to take a few minutes to use some of these other words that are used. And then, as soon as I'm done with that, I have a couple references and we will conclude. Now, the word at the top, as you can see, is the word boat. That is made up of two characters. You have the term vessel. That's the one figure. You notice the part up here on the left-hand side. Then you have also the figure 8 down here. And you come back again to the figure. You have it up here, the figure 8. Now, a little bit of logic tells you what? A boat. 8 people in the ark. Noah. Why would those characters be involved in particular with that particular word? I think, obviously, you can figure out why it would be. This is the word for spirit. As you can see, again, it's made up of various characters. I'll move this up, and you can see here that, first of all, you have the line that represents heaven or above, a figure that represents to cover, and then a figure that represents water. And so if you put that together, you have this figure here. That equals then what's put together totally as rain. And then you have 3 figures of, as I understand it, and if I'm correct on this, the little figure like that means the mouth. It can refer to mouth, it can refer to speech, or it can refer to a person. And they use that to determine persons. And in this case, obviously, there are 3 of them. And then this one over here that puts together up here at the top This figure, worker of magic. Now, I know that probably it's a little bit strange, but isn't that a pretty good definition of the Holy Spirit? The word Spirit. Interesting. Fascinating. This one is the word garden. Again, you notice the figures that are there. I'll move it up here. This figure in particular refers to dust. This again is the little mouth that can mean, in this case, breath. This figure means two persons. The figure on the outside, and if you look at that, that's talking about the figure up here around the outside, actually means an enclosure. And what does he come up with in the end? That equals garden. Now it's interesting, again, you look at that, two people in the garden. You know, what garden do you think they're talking about? Another interesting one is the word to covet or to desire. You have the figures there. I'll bring that up so you can see it. You have then the figures for trees, two trees, plus the figure for a woman equals the word, when they read that, desire or covet. Now again, where do you have that in particular? Where you have two trees. You have the woman where it talks about she desired the fruit and so on and did eat. Where do you get that? Sounds like Genesis to me. This one I also thought was interesting. It's the word for tower. Here's the figure at the top. This one's a little more complicated to show, but to hear this figure for tower, the words that are used that are found in there is the word clay, the word united or joined together. Here, putting those things together, it means an undertaking. You have mankind here, you have one, you have the mouth or speech, and in the end, they are united. You also have the figure for grass, the figure for undertake, as we indicated over here where that came from, the figure for clay and brick, and in the end, you have the word tower, or again coming back here, in particular to the tower. Now, who made a tower, made bricks for unity, to keep people united together? Where did they ever get that? One more. This is the word for to create. It's made up actually of these figures, the dust, and to speak. And you put that together and you come up, again, if you add the pieces together, here's the word to create. You have the dust plus breath, again the mouth. The figure to the side right here of alive equals to talk, walking, to create, which again comes back to that basic principle and the idea. When God created man, he did what? Breathe into him the breath of life. Now turn to Romans chapter 1, and we're going to finish with that in particular. In Romans chapter 1, you have a statement concerning what God would do in giving up the nations. In Romans 1:18 it says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like unto corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Wherefore God gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves." It seems evident to me that at one time, the ancient Chinese knew of the Creator God, and their language depicts it. But somewhere along the way, they turned away from God and turned to idols. Once a great civilization that changed. My reason for doing all this is not to do anything to bring credit against China. My thinking is, the United States of America is doing that very thing. We are going downhill to the point where if man doesn't turn around and there's not repentance in America and there's not a change, one of these days God's going to say of America, if he hasn't already, I'm giving you up. And there's one last thing that we can do, and you're all familiar with the verse, I'm sure, in 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. Now, I realize and understand that that actually was addressed to the nation of Israel. But by application, it does apply to us. And I think as we see America losing what was once a great civilization, we need to pray even more for our country. It's really very crucial. You look at all these things, and I appreciate the fact that those from time to time will give prayer requests and pray for our government officials. We need to do that regularly. It ought to be a daily habit to pray for our officials because we are turning away from God. And our only clue is to actually pray and to bring our nation back to God. And I did this because that's what is prophesied. God said, I will turn you aside, it will set you aside. And I'm afraid that that's what's happening to America. But we still can pray and do what we can. Let's pray. Heavenly Father.